will be us live. Does that make sense?
We are already live.
Okay, you've pressed the button.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Great. So welcome back everyone to the FPL Script. We're doing a very impromptu live stream here for Game Week 17 in terms of our Game Week 17 preview. This is also an episode where we're mostly going to be talking about Haaland and all such things in terms of routes that you can take based on our expected thoughts for Haaland's minutes for the next sort of two crucial game weeks that he would be able to play in, if he is at all, which is Game Week 17 and 19. But before we actually touch on Game Week 17, let's just quickly discuss our Game Week 16 results between my co-host and I. So I'm your co-host, FPL __ Fran on X, otherwise just known as FPL Fran on YouTube. I actually had a relatively good game week, but let's be honest, it was mostly just carried by Heung-min Son and then a little bit of Pedro Porro points because I think most of the field really just had a team that entirely blanked. And I was not too dissimilar. Son carried my game week. Alvarez captaincy completely carried it. Although, obviously, looking back, maybe who knows if I had mistakenly had a vice on Son, that would be even better. But I know some managers really struck out really with Saka vice or maybe Bruno vice because obviously Bruno was pretty
Or
optimal
Trent, even Trent.
and even.
Yeah.
And yeah, ultimately the biggest news as an outcome of that was Haaland is out. But that was my game week 63 points. What about you, Shannon?
Yeah, hello everyone. So, as Fran said, this is a very impromptu stream, and we'll just be talking between us. We don't have any graphics as such to show you this week, so apologies. My week was slightly worse than Fran's. I had 58 points. Fran had three returns, right? In your team, you had three players that returned, I think. You had Son, Salah, and Pedro Porro.
Yeah.
I had two players because only Salah, captain, and Son. That's it. Every single player other than that in my team blanked. I was obviously not planning to play Dubravka this week, but he came on for Areola, and I was also not planning on playing Livramento this week, who came on as well. Uh, I think when we talk about the next week, I think it's even worse because now I have Maguire who's possibly out. I have Eze who is out, and I don't know when he's coming back. And if Palmer gets suspended next week, it's going to be really bad. So we'll see. We'll talk about what we have planned for today, which is we'll quickly go through the topics that we have planned. So I'm just going to get right into it. The first thing is the biggest news, which is obviously Holland out, which is also our thumbnail. Um, let's go through like a brief kind of scenario, I guess branch tree of what we would do possibly. So let's talk about if he's out for only 17, which means that he doesn't play in 17 and 18, where he obviously has a blank game week. So what do you think that people should be planning for in that case?
Yeah, I think it first of all depends on whether you're on a 1 BM because obviously if you're on a 1 BM it suggests that you have either Holland or either Salah. And obviously
Mm.
if you have Salah only on your team, it's probably the case that actually your team is, you know, in very much reality it is entirely optimal. So that setup will probably last you towards, let's say, game week 20 and beyond. Whereas let's say if we were talking about a 1 BM where you owned Holland only, I think that's
Mm.
where the discussion of mass hits should be sort of invited, and I think it's totally fine, right? Ultimately, Holland is someone who you would have been captaining this week. He would have been the most of your EV if you sort of think about it. I believe the EV might have been 7 point something. You know, that's a loss of 14 uh, implied EV, and then obviously you're looking at your secondary captain. Most people on a 1 BM structure where they own Holland only probably don't have someone like Alvarez who has extremely high EV. You don't
Yeah.
have Salah. So in that situation, obviously you're sort of calculating against your second best captaincy. There's an implied EV loss there there, and so I think it makes sense actually to probably take hits back to go into Salah, which I think, for example, you know, MD1 could be former MD1 right now. I'm not sure, but um, you know, for example, Angie Bull is in that exact situation. The best way to really address it is by going to players like Salah and Alvarez through certain hits. And as honestly, most of the fields, including yourself, are facing, you know, we have
Yeah.
suspension, we have injuries. So this is the time where, since you're going to have this massive make weight in terms of Holland, it makes a lot of sense to activate those hits. And I think it could be going up to, let's say, -8 and as I said, including players like Julian Alvarez, including players like Salah in that. Whereas let's say if you're on a 2 structure like yourself and myself, I think it obviously depends on whether you have two, and obviously a lot of this is prefacing that a lot of people I'm expecting have one free transfer because let's
Hmm.
be honest, we've had to deal with, let's say, Mbumo, which probably also means that you've been spending your transfers. But if you have two free transfers, I think you could very well get away with this without a hit. Um, but you probably still also have to go out of Haaland, and it also really depends on whether you own Watkins yet or not, right? Because for some people who went Watkins to Darwin recently, that actually probably suggests if you're one that probably actually suggests you're down a transfer versus the field, and now you're in an even worse spot because you actually have to get Watkins back somehow whilst also dealing with Haaland. So it makes sense, in my opinion, in that situation to go from Haaland to Watkins, to get Watkins back in your team, and then also to then look at other options because Alvarez's expected value is going to be ridiculously high. I believe right now, it's very close at 90 minutes to Salah, but we know that there is residual, for example, Haaland availability on review right now. So the implication actually is that if Haaland is entirely out, that Alvarez's expected value will actually continue to skyrocket. Probably not that much, but um,
It
suffice to
will
say that
inch, yeah, it will
definitely
inch
be
towards like
worth a hit,
seven
I would say.
plus. Exactly, exactly.
Yeah, it would be 7 point something,
Yeah,
wouldn't it? Because
yeah,
right now it's already close to 7.
yeah.
I would imagine probably 7 point, 4, maybe just below Salah,
Hmm.
and that's obviously very close to certain free transfer thresholds as well. So yeah, I think ultimately Alvarez becomes the question of whether you want to take a hit for Alvarez as well in that structure, but you might not need to necessarily do so. Particularly if you think, for example, I think that the key thing with Alvarez as well, just to discuss him, is we know KDB might be back soon. Um, the precise date is unclear. I believe we thought it would initially be the Newcastle game, but some people might be expecting a little bit sooner. I suppose the issue with Alvarez is, yeah, if Haaland is back for Game Week 19, obviously that's implied sort of Alvarez EV boost. We don't know if it's actually reflected on future game weeks as well right
Hmm.
now on review. So maybe
Hmm.
the long-term value of Alvarez will drop, but obviously the short-term could increase massively. And I suppose there's a bit of a balance there. And so, yeah, the question I suppose is whether you go and take that hit for Alvarez, which is something I'm considering because structurally, if you take, let's say, a hit for Alvarez, that would send you towards that sort of 1 VM template team,
Yeah.
right? Particularly if, let's say, that hit for Alvarez is through someone like Archer, which in my case would be something that I'm sort of dealing with myself. And that would allow me to, for example, go for certain players like Trent Alexander-Arnold and sort of put myself in that sort of team structure, and that would also prepare myself for AFCON and Asian Cup in such a way, right, where I just have to bring Haaland back for Salah in Game Week 20, and that's a question a lot of managers will probably need to ask because if let's say Haaland isn't out, there's some other questions to be asked about whether you even want to take Salah out on Game Week 20, but
Hmm.
I think if Haaland is definitely out for this week, it all kind of forces us to a very homogenous path where on Game Week 20 we suddenly just go back into a Haaland structure then in a 1 and that also means that Salah probably leaves as well. But yeah, I mean, do you have any thoughts on that? Because you also own Watkins, so you might be in a slightly better situation, but you also have your injuries and suspensions.
Exactly. And I was looking at, let's say, teams around my rank in different leagues. And what I realized is whatever gain I got from Watkins in terms of points and also saving a transfer, let's say, or two transfers technically, I'm going to lose that immediately, I think, because first of all, I had to spend a transfer to get Mbumo in. And this is exactly where I think long-term planning comes into the picture. I've already spoken about this in previous podcasts, but once again to reiterate, not having a Mbumo on wildcard 10 has such a cascading effect because I effectively had to spend one extra transfer. You rightly pointed out in the last podcast that I would have had to spend a transfer to transfer him out, so I am not going to count that. But the transfer to bring him in is what has effectively now led me to a -4 this week. So on the face of it, the -4 is actually EV positive at Alvarez's current expected value because his expected value is 6.8, and my first bench, like the only bench player I have right now who is going to play is Pinnock, who is at 2.4, I think, which shows just how bad Villa fixture is becoming for defenses, I think. And also, maybe it's also a degeneration of, let's say, Brentford's projections as well. Could be both simultaneously taking place. So that means that the hit is EV positive, although it's not it's not EV positive for everyone. It's EV positive for me because I made a series of decisions that led me to this point. But now I have to forget about all of that and react based on the information we have. And one thing I realized from last season is maybe because bench boost one was such a spectacular failure that I maybe became a little bit too hit averse, which I still am. Like I'm desperately trying to find a way to not take a hit and just keep Holland. But the problem is, forget about this week. Next week, I have to bring in a defender for next week. I can't even bring in Pau Torres now, for example, because he went up in price. So I have to go for someone like, let's say, Ezri Konsa. So instead of that, what I can do is I can do, let's say, Holland to Alvarez, and that's a -4. And the next week I can do Pinnock to Pedro Porro. The week after that, I can do, let's say, Maguire to Trent, and that immediately like seems like a better path expected value wise as well, assuming that Holland is out, obviously, and he is out for at least the blank game week that we know. And the good thing, as you spoke already, is that let's say Salah, we need to bring Salah out of the team to get Holland in 20. That's entirely optional, right? If let's say Holland is not fit by that point, you can just delay that decision. You can keep delaying it till the point that Holland is back. So
True.
it's as long as you don't make early transfers, and I would suggest people not to make early transfers, I guess, because especially in January, I think there's like a deadline on the 13th, and then I think the deadline is on the 30th of January or something. There's like two huge gaps between deadlines in January. So there's even a lot more stuff that can happen. For example, Holland coming back could also happen in that sense because the game weeks are spread far apart. So completely agree with you. I don't think hits are bad this week, but again, you have to look at long-term strategy. Maybe instead of Alvarez, Watkins is better. It's better for you because remember that next week he is the best captaincy candidate.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's no doubt about that. There's no one else close to him. I'm sure people will captain Salah because Salah, in general points, but from an expected value sense, he is definitely the best. And I think the third situation that we have not touched upon is what happens, let's say, if Holland is immediately back. So we find out that they go to Saudi Arabia for the Club World Cup. He plays in the Club World Cup and he's fine. Let's say towards the final of the Club World Cup. What is the contingency plan in that case?
Yeah, I think it's very similar. So once again, as you said, the priority is obviously to go towards Watkins if you don't have him already.
Hmm.
And then, yeah, you have to seriously question whether you want to take that sort of hit for Alvarez. But as you said, I think, um, maybe you can let me know what your free transfer value is. But mine is on default. It's 1.5, but it
Hmm.
still suggests that really a hit towards Alvarez is very much optimal. And all I've done is really adjusted Alvarez's minutes for the Crystal Palace game. And actually, what I've seen already on reviews that he's got pretty much very decayed minutes, right? So there's a
Hmm.
very aggressive decay. So I haven't really adjusted any of his sort of post minutes, obviously, although I recognize that at one point, obviously, KDB's got to come back um, and hugely impact Alvarez. But yeah, I think one of the things I kind of keep coming to is I think if you have, let's say, if we know for sure that he's back for Gameweek 19, then some sort of plan where you do some sort of hokey cokey might make sense. So, for example, my plan right now is to go Holland to Watkins this week, maybe
Hmm.
take that hit towards Alvarez. Not sure whether I would, still just yet, but I think I'm just waiting really for the Holland is officially out confirmation
Hmm.
really before I actually pull that hit.
So the press
But
conference is tomorrow, right? Just for everyone's knowledge.
exactly, yeah.
Okay, yeah,
And
yeah.
and also one thing to say as well, I believe it's also that hit for Alvarez makes so much more sense if you have like a certain suspension or a certain injury that you're
Hmm,
dealing with. For example,
hmm,
like in my team landscape, I've got Gordon who's out potentially, right? Because of course he had a tight hamstring in the Champions League game, and anytime that happens, plus when you only have really 2 or 3 days of rest, I'm struggling to believe that he would have to start again versus Fulham, with his, for example, sort of fitness that precarious right now. So. Yeah, I'm sort of assuming right now that Gordon won't play in the Newcastle or in the Fulham game, at least not serious minutes. And that, of course, makes the hit a lot more friendly. Now, if let's say Gordon, I expected him to start based on an Eddie Howe press conference update, which I'm, struggling to believe that that would be the
yeah,
case. That would be a bit different. That hit for Alvarez, I'd probably have to maybe scale back on my appetite for that. And it's a question, of course, of what sort of bench you guys have this week, right? Taylor is suspended, James is injured, Trippier
yeah.
is suspended. There are a lot of other players like Bruno Fernandes as well, who are impacted this week. And so if you don't have a strong bench, yeah, I think that hit just becomes that much more easy. But it also means that on Game Week 19, I think the crucial thing too, when we go to that fixture and Haaland's availability for that is, let's say even if he starts 90 minutes there, it's not like his expected value is amazing versus Everton away. So the question I suppose a lot of managers should be asking themselves is do I actually like that, right? Do I actually like bringing Haaland back on Game Week 19? I do, just because I'm already on a 3-5-2 structure. And if I don't take that hit for Alvarez, it would make sense for me to, for example, go back into Haaland immediately on 19. But yeah, if I do take that hit for Alvarez, then that question's a bit different. I sort of had to delay until Game Week 20 to bring Haaland back then instead.
Yeah, makes sense. And before we move on, just one more piece of information for context. I think Alvarez got completely rested for the first midweek game in
Yep,
Champions League,
he
which
did.
shows the seriousness that probably Pep has towards the situation, which is that he doesn't want anything to happen to his backup striker, I guess.
Mm,
Not even backup, like the only striker he has left. So he played
exactly.
Grealish for 45 minutes, he played Foden for 45 minutes, but he did not bring on Alvarez at all. Also, Matthias Nunes is fit again. So they're probably stacked in midfield now, and that mm, maybe has a long-term effect on Alvarez as an asset. But for now, there's no doubt. Like we can probably keep his minutes at, let's say, 88, 85, 82, something like that. Like I would not decay it beyond a certain point, like a review does, which is far more aggressive. But to your point, if he is showing up in your solves for a very aggressive decay, he will obviously show up if it's a much slower decay. So that's out of like that's absolutely certain. So the next question is for your team especially, and I'm going to come to you for this, which is Gordon. If you want to transfer Gordon out, given the fact that he had a tight hamstring, he came off for Isaac in the Newcastle AC Milan game. So what options are you looking at, and in terms of like shorter horizon, longer horizon, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think you know, given that Gordon's the actual issue in my team, quote unquote, I suppose there's a question as well if let's say I just go out of Gordon instead, for a hit, something like that. So I think the options are Richarlison, Foden, or Sterling. Obviously, with Sterling, I'd be, for example, jumping into the sort of 4 yellow card landscape, which I don't like
Hmm.
because I already own Palmer. So that's
Yeah.
sort of like doubling up on my suspensions. Um, uh, I suppose with Foden, the issue, of course, is, just sort of worsening my team for the blank. Um, Especially when Gordon can actually be back for Game Week 18, right? Whereas, let's say if I went from Archer to Alvarez, it's not like it really impacts my Game Week 18 EV at
Yeah.
all,
Yeah.
because I mean Archer's Archer, and it's not a good fixture for Sheffield United anyway. So, as you said, and that makes me or that leads me to thinking I'd still probably prefer already sort of moving my team into some sort of 3-4-3 structure instead, as opposed to taking the hit for Gordon. And actually, the one last option, probably the most interesting option, is going to be Richarlison, right? Because we all know that Richarlison, in the current state that he is, right, in FPL,
Yeah.
if he has good minutes, he's probably one of the most broken assets in the game. I previously compared him, with being good minutes to basically being better than Mbumo, which I think is the reality. If you actually, let's say Richarlison at 90 minutes, he is better than Mbumo on EV. But that's the issue, I suppose. Richarlison is probably someone that I would interpret as more so, a 75-minute player right now,
Hmm.
given that he's also coming back from injury. But it's also very likely the case that his minutes could kind of creep up. But I don't want to, for example, like overestimate that, because we've seen that actually French has been happy to sort of change up his team, um, you know, tactically and stylistically as well. With, for example, let's say the Lo Celso substitution last week,
Hmm.
whether he, let's say, plays Richarlison centre forward, whether he plays Son left wing, which seems to be right now the dominant structure. And that obviously has impacts on how we interpret Richarlison as well, right?
Yeah.
And more than likely that makes Richarlison even more positive as an asset, him being the centre forward. I think Andrew's press conference comments on Richarlison are very nice. And, once again, of course, this is very biased towards the player's point of view, but he's also mentioned himself that the surgery has really helped him, and that he was struggling beforehand, particularly with finishing. So, um, take that as what you will, but I do think Richarlison's obviously an option for me. It seems if I, let's say, run Richarlison at 75 expense, and just let him, for example, naturally decay on review.
Hmm.
I see Richarlison more as a Game Week 20 transfer, or either a Game Week 18 transfer instead. Where of course, if let's say Gordon is still struggling, then arguably Spurs actually have a slightly better fixture than Newcastle's, and ultimately he would be a stronger pick, just on average compared to Gordon anyways, in a week where hopefully I don't have to make a Matty Cash transfer, right? Because in my team scenario, I'm hoping that Matty Cash can play Sheffield United at home,
Yeah,
and that would mean I have the propensity to sort of be a bit more aggressive with, let's say, going out of Gordon into Richarlison. But that's really a luxury situation. I think otherwise, as I said, Richarlison's a very, very strong Game Week 20 transfer for a lot of managers.
exactly.
Uh,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
And would you say that because we haven't touched, I think you already touched on Sterling, so I'm going to just kind of talk about four yellow cards because this is the last week that we are really bothered about the situation because we need players for the blank game week. Once we go
Yes.
past the blank game week, we can probably cover any suspensions with a bench player.
True.
So I'm just trying to go through this list. Obviously, Cash is on four yellow cards, and Senesi, who a lot of people have bought because of his back-to-back double-digit hauls, is also on four yellow cards. I'm looking through this list. Kabore is also on four yellow cards. Lascelles is on four. Romero is on four. Udogi is on four. That's pretty significant in FPL terms. In defenders, Sterling, we know. Enzo is also on four. Palmer is on four. I don't think. Yeah, Wang Hee Chan is on four, and I don't think there are any forwards on four cards that we care about. So just the reason I uh, looked at all these names is just be wary of bringing these players in because the week you need them for is primarily the next week. So which is game week 18. Game week 17 is fine. You still have some bench players to cover, but game week 18 is when you will actually need those players to definitely come through in that game. So, for example, I'm also, and this is something that in the solver you have to use sensitivity analysis to kind of look at, which is, for example, what happens if Palmer gets suspended, right? I'm thinking of bringing Alvarez in for Haaland for a hit. And if Palmer gets suspended next week, my bench is basically Eze, Palmer, and Haaland because I'll be
Yeah.
doing Pinnock to Pedro Porro, and I have to hope that Maguire plays. Otherwise, do I take another
True.
hit? Like, where does this end? So I think it's a very tricky week in terms of transfers. I would recommend people to like learn if they can to run some sensitivity analysis onto it on a review because that really helps to understand all kinds of scenarios. Uh, One thing before we talk about captaincy is also the Chelsea defense, and we keep talking about Chelsea defense every week because every week we seem to have updated minutes or updated expectations of their availability. So this week Reece James got injured and he has been confirmed to be injured for 3 months, right? His return to play.
Yeah, that's correct. That's correct.
So 3 months is obscenely long in FPL. So obviously he's no longer an asset. He never was, to be honest. But even if we don't want to be pedantic about it, we can say that he definitely is not now. Uh, what is your expectation? Because again, you're a Colville owner, you've kept the faith, and maybe it's time that finally, with all these injuries, he will start getting steady X minutes.
I'd like to think so. I think obviously he'll probably be rested for one of those games, but that I don't think is something that would exclude any Chelsea player. For example, like if we went through every Chelsea player now that I think is actually relevant to the game, like Badiashile, don't think he's nailed yet. Thiago Silva, question of course is whether he was dropped or not, I suppose, because this is the first time we've seen Thiago Silva be pretty much outright benched by Poch, and I think one thing that's fair to say is, for example, for the attackers, he's given them the same treatment, right? Effectively, every attacker was benched 1 out of 3
Hmm.
fixtures, and so maybe you can say that can also go towards Thiago Silva. So yeah, I also think Thiago Silva is a little too expensive, anyways.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and then actually with Gusto, I think he's the most interesting one in terms of sort of like medium to long term minutes because he's at the most ridiculous price, and the only issue I think is whether he actually makes it towards the Sheffield United game, which I think is a little bit unlikely actually. And then there's the tactical question as well of is Pochettino actually really going to field out teams that have Gusto and Cucurella in it? And if not, who's the player that loses out? I think more likely than not, actually, Cucurella, of course, is going to be the one that loses out, and Colwell Gusto is probably going to be that sort of preferred pairing. It's actually a pairing, of course, that he was sort of utilizing when Chilwell was injured, right? We saw a lot of Colwell and we saw a lot of Gusto
Hmm.
for a few games back to back until Reece James was back, and so I think that's going to be the dominant structure. I think for that reason too, given that you have access to some fullbacks for this Chelsea team, I'd rather go for for example, let's say if you didn't have, if you weren't pressed to make a Chelsea transfer this week, then I actually might wait for Gusto and then actually go
Mm.
for Gusto instead.
Yeah.
Whereas let's say if you were transferring for this week, I think Colwell makes the most sense because you probably have the guarantee that he starts here. Because I don't know what you think about this, but like yeah, I can't see this Chelsea team fielding out Cucurella and Gusto. It would be
Too
such a
often,
weak
at least. Too often. I
defense.
mean,
Yeah,
as you
exactly.
said in the beginning, it could be once in a while when, let's say, maybe the fixtures are piling up like they might at the end of the year. But I really struggle to see how Colville doesn't get regular starts now, given the fact
Exactly.
that they don't have any other dynamic going in the team right now. And also to your point about Gusto, the only problem I see with that is this is like probably their best fixture in this run. And
Yeah.
if you don't get Gusto for this game, you have to look at, let's say, the week after, and does having Gusto for one game less compensate in terms of expected value over someone like Colville, assuming that they play the same number of games. They might not
Yeah.
play the same number of games, but for now, if you do that exercise, you might find that Gusto cannot compensate for this really good fixture against Sheffield United. So if I were to pick this week, I would actually go for Colville still, because I don't know if Gusto is fit enough to start regularly again. But if it's next week, I might change my mind based on what we hear from Pochettino. So definitely something to consider, and good, like it's good to know from a Colville owner's perspective, I guess, because not a lot of them out there, but it's good to understand that. And the last topic, oh sorry, before we move on, Pedro Porro as well. Again, you own Pedro Porro, I don't. I've been talking every week. I want to own him. My plan is to get him next week. Do you think that the lack of clean sheets is going to catch up sometime? Because obviously attacking returns for any defenders is not something that you can depend on. So given their XGC is not the greatest, what are your expectations in general?
Yeah, I mean, look, I've been waiting, for example, for like a Trent-sized haul forever, but it does feel like it's impossible. We've probably lost three of them as well, post 90 minutes, on multiple fixtures like Wolves,
Wolves and
Palace, and
Newcastle.
Newcastle
Yeah,
even.
yeah.
So I'm not necessarily holding out for clean sheets, but I think, look, ultimately, the thing about Pedro Porro is for a lot of teams right now, you don't really expect clean sheets anyways, and there's very few fullback options I would say that are as attacking as he is.
Mm.
Uh, that sort of bring that value, that sort of price, because you have to sort of stretch towards your Trippiers and Trents, and fair enough that they're actually competent defenses. But yeah, that's sort of why I think Pedro Porro is still interesting to me. Um, and yeah, I think ultimately, as we know too, like very weak teams or very weak defensive teams can still get a clean sheet here and there. So I'm not too worried about Porro.
Mm.
His
Mm.
EV on review still looks very, very good. Um, and yeah, of course, he's been fortunate in a sense to get attacking returns week on week on week. But it's not like he's also been vastly overperforming his expected value, right? And
Yeah,
he's
in
like one of those guys.
comparison to other defenders, definitely not, because he's like
Yeah,
at probably like the very top of the XG charts for a
I think
defender.
Bournemouth is such a good example of that too, right?
Yes.
Where you have a team that's
Yes.
we don't necessarily rate their defense too highly, but
Yeah.
they've gotten some clean sheets here and there. I don't think Pedro Porro is, for example, an exception in that circumstance. So I think he's a lovely transfer, but obviously, I'd still wish you don't own him because that's probably our one differential between our teams. Yeah,
Yeah, and honestly, the way the injuries in my team are going could scupper my plans probably next week. Something else
yeah.
crops up, I might have to do something different. But that is the plan for now. And moving on to the final section, which is captaincy, of course. So the top captaincy choices with Holland very dicey on X minutes are Salah at one and Son at two. And I'm just going to mention Sterling and Palmer because they have the best fixture this week.
Yeah.
So do you see people captaining anyone other than Salah if they own him, obviously?
Yeah, Son. I think it's Son.
Okay,
But
over Salah, that because the thing is, market odds
not
have.
over Salah. But I think if you let's say don't abide by EV, you might be leading towards Son.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
that's what I'm saying. Like even market odds have such an inclination for a massive Liverpool win that it's what was it like the third best clean sheet odds Liverpool have had all season or something until now.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. I
Yeah,
think Rob shared a graphic about how the goals expectations are ludicrous
goals
for this game.
expectations. Yeah,
You
my
you
bad.
guys
Yeah.
obviously have like ridiculously I mean, some ridiculous injuries, right, after that UCL game.
Yeah, we don't have Shaw, we don't have
Alvarez
Maguire. Exactly. It's
the team must be at an emotional lull. It's missing its captain. Who
yeah,
knows?
yeah.
So, but yeah, I think that the only reason why I mentioned that because obviously, if you even take like a market point of view, obviously Alvarez is a little bit nerfed compared
Hmm.
to um, how he is on review, right? I think Alvarez is his EV is a little bit lower in market, therefore Son is like that second option. And some people might be obviously looking at 17 points trying to chase, but I also think that the thing about Son too is Nottingham Forest have looked pretty poor as of late, but there's nothing really crying out for a captaincy outside of Salah. Like he is so clear this week.
Yeah, and also because it's at Anfield, and we know that home fixture does play a factor. There's no doubt about that,
Absolutely.
especially when it comes to United going to Liverpool. And I know a couple of guys who are going to that game as United fans, and
Wow.
I would not want to be them. Honestly, like I would not want to be them. So I wish the best for them, but I don't think it's going to turn out what they're hoping it would be. Uh, Sterling Palmer again, if you think this is going to be like a trouncing, maybe you can go for them, but I can't see past Salah this week. It's just very
Okay.
unlikely, very unlikely.
Yeah.
Uh,
I believe both Sterling and Palmer have less EV than Son, anyways. At 90 minutes.
yes, they do. Yeah, they do. I think Alvarez is probably the third
Palmer's higher on
option,
review.
even over these two
Actually
guys.
higher than Son review. Yeah. He actually is.
Exactly. I think it's the only reason I didn't have him in this is because of the uncertainty. Because,
Uncertainty.
you know, let's talk about the worst case for Alvarez captaincy. If Holland comes back or plays even like 10, 15, 20 minutes or something like that, that's really bad for an Alvarez captaincy. So I would just not bother with that uncertainty and go for that. And also, just to mention something, do you on your channel do you have a wildcard video for this week?
Yeah, I had a wildcard draft planned.
Okay, so I think I'm just going to ask people to go watch that because of the time constraint. We couldn't really talk about Wildcard 17 today. We, if we had the time we normally do, we would have definitely talked about it. But because of the time constraint, we won't. So just go and watch Fran's video for
Yeah,
that.
the only thing I'd say as well is like it takes the assumption that Haaland is only out for Game Week 17 and that he's back for Game Week 19. But
Hmm.
still, the loose plan, anyways, as I said, is that it's probably still optimal to actually wait for Haaland on 20
Yeah,
if you think he's out for 17. So that's how impactful, of course, playing Everton away is because it's not that important really in the grand scheme of let's
exactly,
say Haaland.
exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah, and as I was telling people, once I remove Holland, Everton away becomes a much more difficult fixture. So
100%. Yeah.
that's how I'm
Oh,
ruling
true.
with it.
Good point
Yeah,
as well.
yeah, yeah.
Actually, one thing I
So
also wanted to talk about just before we leave is
yeah.
on Game Week 18, we've got a lot of interesting picks from teams like Fulham and even Bournemouth, arguably. But
Hmm.
I think specifically for Fulham, like a lot of people are going to be actually, yeah, if you say, for example, transfer to Game Week 18, players like Douglas Luiz and players like Andreas will be
Hmm.
definitely extremely meta. So if you let's say are struggling with your midfielder transfers, that's something you might want to decide upon too. Because I know we talked about Richarlison, and
Yeah.
obviously he seemed to
Yeah.
be the sort of FOMO pick as of late because he scored a brace. But yeah, like those are other competing picks that are really good at even cheaper price points. And yeah, I mean, if you probably have the best team structure available, I suppose you could really own Richarlison and Andreas, and actually Palmer might drop to the wayside. But just an
Uh,
interesting food for thought
One
if you
thing I
can
would
hold
say
your
is,
trend.
unlike other seasons, Andreas seems to have less X-Men this season overall. I've seen
Hmm.
him get sub
He did
a
start the
fair
season
few
with the
often.
injury though,
He
so
did.
that was a key thing. Yeah.
That's a fair point. But again, there are far too many attackers in this team, so I can see
Yep.
him possibly get subbed off, let's say 80 minutes rather than playing the 90, which he used
Right.
to do last season every single game. So that's something to consider. I know that's not going to change it by much because he still has excellent expected value on review.
Yeah.
Uh, do you want to quickly take questions? I can field them if you want to leave, and I can quickly run through them.
Yeah. I'm gonna head off, but
Yeah,
enjoy the questions and thank you so much for hosting the show today.
yeah. Thanks, Fran. See you next week.
All right. See you. All. Bye.
So, hi chat. I'm just going to quickly go through the questions and we can um, answer them with obviously a subtext of run solves on review and check the expected value. So, K7 says good night, guys. Hi, K7. Ramatuli says hello. Hi. Okay, what's the first question? I had Saka vice captain. I've seen a lot of managers who got burned by that. The Watkins to Darwin move has cost a lot of -4s. Yep, absolutely. With the information we had at the time, it was a perfectly fine move. I wouldn't beat myself up about it. It's perfectly okay. Are you all saying get Alvarez for Holland and also bring in Solanke as a third forward, including Watkins? That's what I'm doing. So I got Solanke and I'm also getting Alvarez for Holland because that's how high his expected value is. I don't know if it's okay for every single team, but it's just what my team needs, I guess. Because I know Alvarez blanks next week, but there isn't another striker bar, let's say someone like Isaac. But even Isaac's minutes are so dicey. He probably will start against Fulham, but I don't know how many minutes he'll play, so I'm definitely not a fan of that. Who to bring in after this game week, Trent or Trippier? I think Trent for me. Of course, there's like a 1.3 million difference between them. So if money matters, I would definitely look at Trippier. But if money does not matter, Trent, I think, by some margin because his expected value is that much higher. So Mr. Blanky, I hope that answers that. If you didn't have any Arsenal attackers, who would you bring in? Giannis says Saka, Odegaard, or Jesus. Saka is my number one choice. There is no one close to him in Arsenal attack. Maybe Odegaard a distant second. Hassan says, will Moreno start? I highly doubt it, but given the fact that Digne, I think, came on today for the Europa Conference League game and played 20 minutes, it seems that he is still the preferred first team 11 player. So I would not look at Moreno for this week or even the next 2 weeks. K7 says, do I bench Adingra and start Shimikas? I have double Arsenal in defense. Yeah, I would probably bench Adingra with the fact that he's played so many games on the bounce. But I mean, it's so weird. Like, Deserby doesn't seem to be giving Adingra a rest at all. So I don't know how that will work. Normally, I would say this, but I am all over the place with Adingra when it comes to his expected minutes. So just head on to Emma, who is on Twitter and she or X, and she has a predictor league kind of for every single team. So there's like a prediction hive mind, and have a look at what they suggest in terms of his starting probability and go from there. So I would not take it as gospel, but that's a good reference point and a good starting point. My plan is Archer to Solanke tonight, then take the hit for Holland to Watkins tomorrow. If you don't play alternatives to get one of two and play adding an Arsenal, what do you think? Yes, I would go with that. Yeah, Archer to Solanke is exactly what I did. So yes, I would absolutely do that. And Konza as well. Yeah, if you do that, then yeah, I can see the merit in that. Freeing money for Holland, like freeing money from selling Holland for Watkins is something I would definitely consider. I know there's a lot of FOMO when it comes to these things where people think, oh, what if he comes back? The good thing is he doesn't play in 18. He has a relatively bad fixture in 19. You can bring him back in 20. You can easily roll the transfer in 19 if he plays. You have two free transfers in 20 to do whatever you want. Salah has a difficult fixture anyway, so it's an easy switch for you. And you can captain Salah in 19 anyway. I don't think anyone was going to captain Holland that week, so it doesn't matter to that extent. Uh, Hassan says, thank you. You're welcome. K7 says, taking a -8 to move Martinelli to Saka and Holland to Alvarez. Were you the one who was asking to whether to start Martinelli against Luton? I hope you listen to us because we definitely recommended you to start him and he did score. So hopefully you got his points then. Um, I'm not so sure about the -8. Again, I would run your team on review with expected value and see what comes up. I'm suspecting a -8 is almost never optimal in terms of expected value. So I would probably look at maybe doing two of those moves, unless there's something you need to do in order to free up the cash, which I suspect you don't, because Martinelli to Saka is easily, you can easily postpone it, right? Holland to Alvarez, yes, I agree with that. I'm doing the same. Okay, so you're saying yes, you did. What's your first move then? Because this the -8 only has two moves. So what was your third move? If you can help me out. This is probably the last kind of question that I'm fielding because I also have to rush off. Unfortunately, I'm traveling for 16 hours tomorrow. Yeah, you're welcome. I mean, other than that, I think we've probably tackled everything that we wanted to talk about this week. Just keep an eye on all the four yellow card situations, and if K7 is no longer there, I'm just gonna leave it at that. Hope everyone has a good game week. If you haven't subscribed, please subscribe, share it on podcasts. Wherever you're listening to this, make sure to rate it 5 star. Hopefully, you all have a good game week,